In this section, we'll discuss the perspective of personality psychology. So what is personality when we're talking about it from the psychological perspective? Personality is an enduring pattern or set of characteristics of behavior of an individual that persists across different situations. That's kind of a clumsy way to describe it. So I like to think about what kinds of adjectives might we use to describe someone's characteristics. Let's take, for example, our friend Samwise Gamgee. Those of you familiar with The Lord of the Rings might describe Sam in a variety of ways. But you would probably use terms such as loyal, kind, generous, conscientious, or optimistic. Those adjectives indicate some sort of measure of his personality. Your textbook authors focus rather heavily on Freud in this particular section of the text. I do think that the psychodynamic theory of personality is important to understand, but it's very important for you to understand that this is a historical approach to personality. Modern theorists disregard much of Freud's theory as untestable and unscientific. However, some of the features that we're going to discuss in this video have led us to understand some things about the unconscious mind, like what we talked about in the cognition sections. Freud said that the mind and the self and the personality was made up of three forces that were interacting with each other in the conscious and the non-conscious mind. Deep below the surface of consciousness, in the unconscious mind, resides the id. The id is the location of all of our base instincts and impulses, and Freud said that it operates under the pleasure principle, the idea that we should be seeking whatever it is that pleases us at any moment. And you can understand that if we all operated according to the pleasure principle all the time, the world would be chaos. Freud described the superego next. The superego, both conscious and non-conscious, represents our internalized ideals that we've been taught, for example, from our parents, the government, or other sources of authority. What's right and wrong? That internalization becomes our conscience, which helps to regulate the impulses of the id and prevent us from engaging in the pleasure principle. The third piece, the ego, represents the executive control function of the personality. What I mean by that is that it mediates the conflict between the pleasure principle of the id and the guilt of the conscience and the superego. This understanding of the mind and personality having both conscious and non-conscious components was incredibly important and was foundational to the further study of non-conscious influences on behavior. As I mentioned, I won't in this video spend a lot of time on the historical details of Freud's psychosexual model and the defense mechanisms, but I encourage you to be very familiar, particularly with the defense mechanisms. The second perspective we'll discuss is the Rogerian or humanistic perspective. This perspective focused much more on the self and the individual than on making any generalizable findings about personality across people. What I mean by that is that this humanistic approach took a very self-focused and subjective approach to understanding personality. This humanistic approach has given us a very interesting model to understanding conflicts in personality. Rogers identified the ideal and the real self and demonstrated that his clients were able to distinguish between and describe the two. And the distance between the ideal self and the real self indicated and helped us predict something about that person's individual feelings of depression or anxiety. The more matched our ideal and real selves are, the more in harmony and peace we feel. The more mismatched they are, the more discomfort and stress we feel. Modern researchers have done some interesting things examining a third factor, the ought self, the person who I think I should be. The difference between the ideal, the ought, and the real self reveals something about how a person sees themselves and their place in their personality. This Rogerian perspective is very important for clinical and counseling perspectives, but since it's so subjective and person-focused, it doesn't give us a lot of information about how personality functions across individuals, just within. Most of the modern research in personality is based in trait theory. Hans Eysenck was one of the first researchers to demonstrate an approach that we now call the trait perspective. He described individuals as varying across two different categories: their general emotional stability or instability, and their general introversion or extroversion. Plotting individuals across these two axes allowed us to see where they might fall in a variety of different kinds of personality traits. So someone who is particularly extroverted and emotionally stable might be responsive and talkative and easygoing, where someone who's introverted and unstable might be pessimistic or sober or anxious and moody. Personality researchers have arrived at these 5 general traits on which individuals vary that help us get a picture of their personality across situations. Since we're in Maine, I like to remember these with the acrostic CANOE. C for conscientiousness, A for agreeableness, N for neuroticism or emotional stability, O for openness, and E for extroversion. Individuals can vary wildly on these 5 different qualities. But remember, psychology's goal isn't just to describe, as this does, it's also to explain and predict and control. The trait perspective of personality has provided a lot of data and a lot of really good research indicating that these qualities are stable over time and that they allow us to predict attitudes and behavior. For example, conscientiousness predicts success in both the academic and professional worlds. So what is the relationship between these personality traits that persist over time and across situations, and the influence of the situations that we talked about in the social chapter? While it does appear that situational forces are more powerful, these dispositional qualities help adjust how we respond to those situations, so much so that there's a reciprocal relationship between the two. Personality traits predict what kinds of situations individuals might find themselves in, and those situational forces reinforce those traits. What's really neat about the relationship between the situation and the person is that we can tell something about people's personality by looking at their behavioral residue. This picture here is of Sam Gosling in his office. Sam does research on how people perceive others' personalities from their stuff. So, looking at Sam's office, how might you rate him on those big 5 personality measures? Do you think he's very open, particularly conscientious, maybe emotionally stable or unstable? Sam has a variety of studies on this subject, where he invites participants into others' dorm rooms or allows them to look at each other's music or movie collections, and then rate one another's personality. Having never met the other individual, participants are quite accurate in rating the personalities. It seems like these traits are intuitive for us, that we pick them up in ourselves and that we recognize them in other people, and we use them to estimate what their behavior might be like. Take the time this week to find an online measure of the Big 5 and see how you feel it captures your personality.